Az ülést megnyit.
I'd like to open this sitting. Our first point on the agenda is a report by Ms. KIIL-NIELSEN with the title Women and Climate Change.
Monsieur le Président, bonjour chers collègues.
President, ladies and gentlemen, well, first of all I'd like to thank my colleagues and in particular I'd like to thank them for the very important contributions they've made to this report, and I hope this will be the beginning of some awareness in our institutions as regards women and climate change. These issues are very much ignored in this Parliament, although they should be part of every debate we have here in this Parliament. Women's affairs affect all issues, but this is something we have to constantly keep reminding ourselves of. In the Women's Committee, it's our responsibility to get women more visible in European politics, especially as regards environmental affairs. I'd like to point out that in our report we point out that women are not exactly taken care of when it comes to the environment. If you look at cyclones, earthquakes, tsunamis, women have 4 times higher risk of dying following these events. For example, in the tsunami in 2004 in Asia, and also if you look at the heat wave we had in 2003 in Europe, 70% of the victims on that occasion were women. Why? Well, it's because women don't have the same economic, social and political resources which allow them to be flexible or even to flee. The thing is, now that if we had an alert system which allowed women to be taken into account, in particular when disasters take place, you'd have no women victims, as was the case in Lusaka last year. But now we're suffering at this economic crisis. The environment is suffering. People are paying less attention to this and also less attention to women's affairs. So what we would propose is that we take a consistent political view to women's affairs and come up with effective solutions. Every time we have a crisis or a revolution where people say, look, we'll take care of women's rights afterwards, but this never happens. We now face the challenge of climate change, and in this challenge we have to take account of justice and fairness for women. These are intrinsically part of the solution. Women are not just victims to be protected. Women have knowledge and skills and proposals to make, not because they're different in nature, but because women live in societies in which roles are gender-based. Whether you're a man or a woman has an effect on your everyday life, the way you manage your resources, the way you have access to education, and the way you choose your job in life. Men and women have different experiences, and the experiences women have can be used when it comes to devising proposals and solutions. Now, in this report, we think in terms of 4 different measures. First of all, representation. We believe that at least 40% of financial management boards and so on should consist of women, and this is something we feel we should support. As regards the protection of women and education, there we think we have to start up a virtuous circle for women, moving them from victims to players in policy. And when it comes to building the green economy, we feel we should encourage women to undertake technical and scientific careers, and also we believe that we should assist them change their lifestyle. This is necessary. And then in terms of research, we need to collect disaggregated data per gender in order to improve our understanding of these issues and in order to improve our political proposals. Let me summarize the spirit of this report. We believe that the fight against climate change will be more successful if we take account of gender and put an end to gender discrimination. We believe in this way we'll provide better solutions for the climate change problem, and this will be a win-win situation. This is a very complex challenge. Climate change in particular is a very complex challenge, which we're going to have to take account of in the run-up to 2020. We have to make progress in this area.
Thank you to the rapporteur. And now on behalf of the Commission's opinion will be given by Mr. Potočnik in 3 minutes.
Mr. President, honourable members,
On behalf of the Commission and in particular of my colleague Connie Hedegaard, who unfortunately cannot be here today, I very much welcome the report prepared on women and climate change, and I would like to thank the rapporteur for excellent work and also for a very convincing opening statement. This is a good opportunity to discuss how the EU can help women put their stamp on the future climate policy. Climate change is already a fact of life for many on our planet, especially in the developing world. Climate change affects hit the most vulnerable, as you know, the hardest. In the poorest and least developed countries, women, children and the elderly are the first to suffer. As the report rightly says, even though climate change is gender neutral, its effects are gender differentiated. When addressing climate change, the EU looks at how consumption and lifestyle patterns have an impact on our environment. By supporting sustainable, green, low-emission development, we are helping to mitigate the effects of climate change and stimulate economic development, which will make the poor and vulnerable, predominantly women and children, the principal beneficiaries. The EU supports mitigation actions through the geographic and thematic programmes of this development cooperation. As an example, I would like to mention the Sustainable Energy for All Summit this week in Brussels, where 2 panels were dedicated to access of sustainable energy for women. Better access to modern, sustainable energy, such as cooking stoves, will reduce the use of traditional biomass and therefore also reduce deforestation. It will also increase the available time women have, which would otherwise be spent on collecting wood and cooking on inefficient fires. We have to ensure that we have more of such win-win programmes. The EU will also aim to mainstream climate change adaptation into EU policies, including migration and disaster risk reduction. It is all about being forward-looking in order to minimise the inevitable adverse impacts of climate change and gender inequality. Gender is already among the 11 social impacts which should be screened as part of any impact assessment done today by the Commission before it makes any kind of a proposal. And as underlined in the report, gender neutral policies start by gender balanced representation in policy definition. Decision makers need to listen to women and make use of their knowledge in adaptation and mitigation strategies. However, while women constitute the majority of the world's poor, women's voices are often not heard enough. Women are underrepresented in national decision making and in international climate negotiations. In the recent communication on renewed EU-Pacific Development Partnership, it is stated clearly that gender inequalities may hamper the country's capacity to address climate change impacts. This is particularly relevant in a region like the Pacific, where women are underrepresented in public decision making and levels of gender-based violence remain high. Pacific leaders acknowledge the need to take women's experience, knowledge and priorities better into account if they are to address the impact of climate change successfully and be able to achieve sustainable development. In line with the goal of raising women's representation to the 40% level advocated in this report, women have indeed chaired the last 3 UNFCCC conferences of the parties, and the Durban COP adopted decisions explicitly referring to the need to ensure gender balance in the Adaptation Committee and the Standing Committee on the Climate Finance. The EU needs to ensure, as far as possible, the gender balance amongst the members of these bodies. The Danish Presidency decision to present the set of indicators on women and climate change to the Council illustrates the fact that this critical area is high on the agenda. This is an important step towards developing a comprehensive toolkit to evaluate the gender dimension of decision making and policies at all levels. We will need funding, we will need capacity building to enhance women's knowledge about climate change and about how to adapt their daily lives. It is our responsibility to give the concerns of women and the most vulnerable a place in national and international climate policy. The report before us is a very useful contribution in advocating climate equity, and I commend it and applaud to the rapporteur and the European Parliament for this initiative. I would like to conclude on this positive note. I truly believe that climate action can contribute to development in the world's poorest regions and improve the living conditions of many men and women in the developing world. The Commission will continue to mainstream gender issues into policy making, including the fight against climate change and adaptation to the adverse effects of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, on behalf of the ENVI Committee, we shall listen to Ms. LIOTARD in 1 minute.
Thank you very much. And firstly, big thanks to our rapporteur. The poorest categories of people in the world are to 70% made up of women. And as the rapporteur and the Commissioner has said, climate change hits women the hardest. They are the major victims of natural disasters and conflicts and so on. Now, ironically enough, women belong to the population category who actually have the least effect on the climate. And the proportion of women who make decisions about the climate is far too low. They are the real experts. They're the ones who have the experience. And so I think it's women who could make a good contribution to achieving better climate policies. There's not enough knowledge about gender equality and climate change, but I think we can say that more equality would be better for the climate, and a better climate would contribute to more gender equality. I'm thinking here about many women who carry water and have to spend a lot of time carrying water or wood backwards and forwards, and they can't use this time, therefore, to study or finish their education. We need to change this situation, and I think that a clever woman is one who's prepared for climate change. Thank you.
And now, on behalf of the political groups, I give the floor to the representative of the European People's Party, Mariya Nedelcheva.
Thank you very much, President. Colleagues, I'd like to start by thanking Mrs. Nielsen for her excellent work and the shadow rapporteurs, which look at the role that women can play in tackling climate change and which demonstrates the intrinsic link between gender equality and protecting the environment. Today, more than ever, we need to make clear that we won't make headway if we exclude women, i.e. more than 50% of the global's population, if we lock them out of commercial, environmental and political decisions. Women are agents for change, agents for protecting the environment, not just because they're often hardest hit by policy consequences, but also because they are most at ease, most aware of the bad practices. And so we need to try to persuade women to be agents for change when it comes to preserving and protecting the environment. I also think environmental protection also means that women should be able to access education on this. The European Union is duty-bound to inform women and to open up the doors of scientific research so that they can access greater knowledge and expertise. So we should be promoting women as well in decision-making positions so that we have a broader raft of green solutions helping us to better manage the environmental issues, at the same time fostering gender equality. We should also stress the importance of gender equality and the ostracizing of women in terms of sustainable development. Getting women involved in preservation and management of the environment can help us to deliver the MDGs and deliver in terms of the challenges of climate change. This is a virtuous circle where women help to protect the environment and where sustainable development helps women to access economic, natural and scientific resources. It's a win-win situation. Member States and the Commission need to step up the added value of internal and external instruments and development policies, provided that we help to promote the rights of women, gender equality, economic growth, sustainable development and environmental protection. The links are finally reinforced. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, on behalf of the S&D Group, Ms. Estrela has the floor in 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the rapporteur, Mrs. KIIL-NIELSEN. She has produced an interesting and well-structured report. Good cooperation between colleagues and shadow rapporteurs allowed us to reach a broad consensus. The effects of climate change are not neutral from the point of view of gender. Climate change do not affect men and women in the same way, nor does climate change affect the rich and poor, nor developed countries and developing countries in the same way. The effects of climate change are worse in the poorer regions, and they can aggravate existing inequalities. Women are victims of many kinds of discrimination. They're particularly affected by poverty. 70% of the poor are women, and women are also more vulnerable to the effects of climate change and to the effects of natural disasters. The elimination of inequalities and the fight against climate change are linked. There will not be any climate justice without true gender equality. Natural disasters have a considerable impact in the medium and long term in terms of education, health, structural poverty and relocation of populations. Poor children are particularly vulnerable to the effects of natural disasters. Where you have natural disasters, school attendance is lower. Droughts and famine due to climate change oblige women to work more in order to guarantee the supply of water, food, energy, and frequently young girls give up school in order to help their mothers in this work. For these reasons, we need to implement measures designed to bring about greater equality between the genders, and especially in the context of natural disasters. On the other hand, women are used to managing natural resources, which means they possess a potential which should not be neglected as we increase our efforts to attenuate the effects of climate change and adapt to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, the Liberal Group's speaker, Mr. Johansson, has the floor.
President, colleagues, Commissioner, I also would like to congratulate the rapporteur for her work on this report. It's a very important report, and my contribution also is about the link between these questions, both and the consensus in the European Parliament and in the other European institutions about it. Women have less access to resources, political power and education, and also women and children are hit harder by the negative effects of climate change. 3/4 of the world's refugees are women and children, and to improve the current situation we need small and large-scale measures to be taken. Without a holistic approach, we're going to miss good ideas and important pieces of the puzzle. Women consume in a more sustainable way and tend to be more climate friendly than men. Women can be a driving force in the developing of new climate smart ways to use water and energy effectively in the household and elsewhere. We need a responsible and efficient use of resources in every household and every workplace. The EU and Europe as a whole needs to be at the forefront of making use of men and women's ideas, creativity and resources so that we can focus them all on climate challenges. It's the combination of men and women that can, if they can work together, can guarantee more fair and comprehensive strategies in this area. For example, we need better representation of women in the policy-making bodies that can have an effect on these questions, for example, in climate negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, on behalf of the ECR group, Marina YANNAKOUDAKIS has the floor.
Climate change conference, a deal was reached thanks to 2 women. It was direct talks between the EU Climate Action Commissioner and India's Environment Minister that paved the way for an agreement. The conference was chaired by an equally strong woman, South Africa's Minister for International Relations and Cooperation. Yet this report chooses to ignore the achievements of these women. This report would reduce their success to a number, as it calls for 40% quotas for women on climate change negotiation teams. I've explained to this House many times that quotas patronise women. Nevertheless, this craze for quotas persists. We have seen demands for quotas in business and in politics. Now climate diplomacy is the target for quota enthusiasts. Quotas distort equality. They also degrade women who have made it to the top because they're the best people for the job. Climate change is a global challenge, and we need global agreements to tackle it.
Thank you. And now, on behalf of the EFD group, Mr. Roger Helmer has 1.5 minutes.
Mr. President, this report represents an heroic attempt to link two of this Parliament's main obsessions, women's rights and climate change. But sadly, it fails to achieve that objective. Climate change gets blamed for many things, mostly without justification. But few people will believe that domestic violence against women is caused by climate change, or that the low representation of women in government is caused by global warming. Some will feel that it's discriminatory we don't have a report on men and climate change. After all, men and women live in the same climate. Women and men switch on the same lights and televisions and computers. Both men and women inhale oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. But the report does make one valid point, that women are less able to respond and adapt in the face of changes such as global warming and its side effects. Mr. President, the biggest side effect of global warming is the huge economic damage that our climate mitigation policies are doing. High energy prices and excessive regulation are driving jobs and industries and investment out of the EU altogether to other jurisdictions, typically with lower environmental standards. Sadly, it is probably the case that this will impact more seriously on women and on the poor than on the rest of us. The best thing we can do for women and for the poor of this world and for all mankind is to scrap our absurd and damaging climate policies.
Thank you. Our next speaker is, on behalf of the GUE-NGL, Mr. Gustafsson in 2 minutes.
President, firstly, let me warmly thank Mrs. KIIL-NIELSEN for her outstanding work and cooperation on this report. The fact is that this report is historic because it's, as far as I know, it's the first time that the European Parliament is looking at climate questions from a gender perspective. The report makes it clear that climate change is not gender neutral. For example, although men contribute to a higher level than women do to climate change, it's women who are hit the hardest. Men's lifestyle leaves a larger environmental footprint. Women consume in a more sustainable way and also seem to be more willing than men to act in an environmentally friendly way. It's important that the report emphasizes climate justice, because today's injustices would be even greater if we weren't to tackle the issues of climate change. It would hit poor countries in general, and women in particular. The MDGs are in jeopardy, therefore, if we destroy the environment. The discrimination in favour of men, which runs through the whole of society today, is also present in climate discussions. That's why I support the proposal in the report for targeted measures such as quotas to increase women's representation at all levels in the decision-making process. The EU and its member states need to lead by good example and be much better in this area. Women are very important key actors to fight climate change. Many good examples show that the education of women can save lives when a catastrophe occurs. It can increase biodiversity and decrease desertification and protect forests. So when women take part in climate work, often their position in society is also strengthened, and this leads to increased democracy and promotion of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. I can't see Mr. Nick Griffin in the chamber, so I'll give the floor to... Okay, we'll change the order of speakers because Mr. Griffin is just arriving. First, I'll give the floor to Ms. Joanna SKRZYDLEWSKA.
President, when we talk about women and climate change, well, it's a novelty in a way. But taking account of the fact that women are very much important when taking decisions concerning the domestic issues, and also they are the more active representatives of civil society, I believe that more attention should be drawn to this phenomenon. If we think about how women could get involved more in the fight against the climate change, I think the following could be done. First of all, we should increase the number of women who are educated, especially in universities of technology. This would allow them to become experts. But also they could be employed in sectors that are directly involved in the fight with climate change. Also, the number of decision makers working in this sector could be increased. I'm talking about women. Also, political strategies should take account of the position of women in this regard, especially when it comes to equal access to the so-called eco-economy for men and women. I would also like to say that apart from long-term strategies, we need really quick changes, day-to-day changes that should enhance the possibility of women when it comes to access to credit, especially microcredit. Through innovation, I believe that women with access to microcrediting and also the related services could become important actors in creating eco-economy and dealing with negative consequences of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ms. Dă NCILă in a minute and a half.
Mike, please.
Mulțumesc, domnule președinte.
Thank you very much, President. The major challenge facing humanity today is the climate change challenge. And this is inextricably linked with gender equality. Natural disasters and their impact cause more than 14 times the number of deaths among women than among men. 70% of the poorest in the world are women working primarily in the farming sector. 85% of people who have died by climate change driven natural disasters are women. 75% of climate refugees are women, and women are most likely to be the victims of resource-fueled wars and the drive to get resources, the climate change disasters. The problem as well is that women struggle to access services, also to access drugs. Women also are not property owners. They can't get loans. They can't take part in the decision-making process. They're just some of the reasons why women are less able to adapt to climate change. And when you talk about this subject, we're not trying to create competition between women's rights and climate change, but we need to find the right solutions so that we can make headway in both areas at the same time. I'd like to congratulate the rapporteur, and we should have gender equality criteria as an analysis tool in all policy areas. We need to better understand the gender dimension of climate change to get the best solution possible.
Thank you. The next speaker is Ms. Parvanova in a minute and a half.
Mr. Commissioner, dear colleagues, I would like to congratulate Ms. KIIL-NIELSEN for the great work accomplished. I very much welcome this report calling for a greater role for women in tackling climate change, and I believe that the integration of gender issues in climate change policies would make them more effective, efficient and fair. Statistics show that women are disproportionately affected by climate change, notably as victims of climate and resource-related wars, natural disasters, and in terms of infectious diseases, malnutrition and gender-based violence. We have to take into account this issue within Europe's climate diplomacy and ensure that climate change and disaster reduction measures are gender responsive. Gender mainstreaming would allow mitigating the gender-related discrimination and using women's potential. To understand better the gender aspect of climate change and develop informed and responsive adaptation strategies, the collection of gender disaggregated data should be promoted. While recognising that gender is an important factor in combating climate change, the Union's first and foremost priority should be achieving a legally binding international climate change commitment. For that reason, it is crucial for the EU to primarily address the climate change issue on global level and convince international partners to set aside differences in order to reach a sustainable, credible and long-lasting agreement. It is urgent for policymakers to reach such an agreement which is gender-sensitive and should include mitigation and adaptation strategies. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Mr. Griffin. For 1.5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, it would be easy to mock this report. Indeed, it is being laughed at by millions of British voters reading their papers this morning. Coming at a time when the Euro disaster is breaking nations and driving desperate people to suicide, this staggering exercise in politically correct sloganising could, had it been on the agenda at the start of this month, easily have been mistaken for an April Fool's joke. But in truth, this attempt to institutionalise discrimination and contempt against half the population of Europe is not a laughing matter. Men and women are conceived to complement each other for the common good. This proposal is an attempt to sow discord between the sexes, break family values and export EU Frankfurt School poison worldwide using the excuse of climate change. Such incitement to gender-based contempt, division and hate is not a victimless crime. Hundreds of thousands of men are denied access to their children after bitter divorces. Thousands of children are snatched by the state because the crucial importance of fathers and loving united families is denied and undermined by militant feminism of the sort that underlines this report. Meanwhile, there are real problems out there, hurting real people. Voters expect us at least to try to solve them, not to waste our time and their money on sexist, anti-male, anti-family gibberish. Ladies and gentlemen, please, let's drop this empty, bigoted sloganising and work together to deal with real problems. Thank you.
Well, the next speaker is Ms. Striffler in 2 minutes.
Excusez-moi, Monsieur le Président.
President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, climate change should be treated and dealt with as a whole, not just by the EU but at world level. Nevertheless, it's true that women, and especially women living in developing countries, are the first victims of climate change. The constant discrimination which women suffer in terms of income, in terms of access to resources, in terms to decision-taking in politics, these are all factors which explain the extreme vulnerability of women when natural disasters occur, especially in the developing countries. Our fight against climate change must take into account the question of gender, just as our development aid policy has to take into account the role of women in developing countries. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, the European Union should do everything it can to promote the role of women in developing countries and in the major international bodies, and in particular at the United Nations conferences on the climate. From time to time, I think I'm imagining things or dreaming, especially when I hear the sort of comments we've just had. It's time that gender equality was at the heart of our planning and our policy making for development, for human rights and for the fight against climate change and global warming. Thank you.
Thank you. Next to speak in 1.5 minutes is Marita ULVSKOG.
Thank you, President. This report shows how men and women cause climate change to differing degrees, and it shows that we have differing access to common resources and that we are hit in different ways by climate change. Now, we need further knowledge about this kind of thing if we want to change attitudes, behavior, and change the world. That's what most of us in this House want to see happen, even if perhaps we don't all take the same line. Now, in the EU and in other parts of the world, we need more of this kind of knowledge. Now, we do enter into trade and environmental agreements with other parts of the world, and we need to have gender equality aspects included in those. I'd like to thank Mrs. KIIL-NIELSEN for this report on climate politics, which takes a rather different perspective than the normal one, and that's very good because most of us know that political solutions become more effective if we are aware of class and gender perspectives within them, and that's also true when it comes to climate policies. If we want our climate policies, which we decide upon here with a large majority, to become more than just empty words on paper, then we need reports which lead us in the right direction, as this report does. So once again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker, Andrea ZANONI, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. The fight against climate change is critical if our planet is to survive. It's critical for Europe and all stakeholders to commit to keeping the average temperature rise to 2 degrees C. This is the only way to avert natural disasters and migration and the displacement of people that comes in the wake of these disasters. And there is a broad consensus at the international level that the poorest people are most affected, 70% of whom are women. Women in the third world who are playing a critical role in terms of providing food and properly managing water, both for domestic use and for farming. And it's women who today need to work harder because of drought and because of the lack of water, which stems from climate change. That's why gender needs to be part and parcel of all negotiating processes as part of the UN framework on climate change, so that it's possible to improve the well-being of women around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Christa KLASS is next in 2 minutes.
Thank you, President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. The climate is changing. Women are affected, and women can do something about this. And it would be laughable if we all made speeches such as Mr. Griffin has a moment ago. This is a serious matter, and experts and scientists are looking for solutions, and of course often disagree with one another. We can be certain there's going to be disagreement on climate change, but one thing is certain: if we carry on using up the resources of the world, they'll soon be all used up. Either way you look at it, energy saving is necessary. The climate change has an effect on the environment, but also on our water supplies, food supplies, and these in turn will lead to social difficulties. The Women's Committee, in its report on women and climate change, calls for a greater inclusion of women in these matters, because half of humanity is women. 70% of the poorest people in the world and 80% of refugees are women. It is important to help women through training and education so that they're more involved in the effort against climate change. Women play an important role in the way resources are managed in the private sphere. They decide how and what will be used to heat or to cool a house. Don't forget that half of our energy in our homes is wasted, and this does nothing to help us reduce CO2 emissions. Women are also playing an important role in the bringing up of children, and in turn, yet again, the way resources are used. So women's abilities must be used, especially in leadership roles. This is not happening, though, around the world. The report points to ways we can change these situations, but we have to, during this debate, to concentrate on women and climate change. and not the debate on quota or reproduction and so on and so forth. This will not help us in this particular debate. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Ms. Blinkevičiūtė.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the rapporteur for her work. Yes, indeed, we do not realize sufficiently the gender aspect and its relation to the fight against climate change. And Mr. Griffin does not really understand the core of the matter. In this area, we need to work harder because gender mainstreaming into climate change is not happening yet. The whole humankind is suffering from climate change, but natural disasters have shown that it is mainly women and children who suffer from natural disasters, and it hits most heavily women and children in the developing world. Women are employed in the farming. They actually work too hard, and then they do not have sufficient access to health care. We lack gender disaggregated data which could allow us to assess the gender aspects in the fight against climate change. Fight against climate change has to be a priority in EU policies. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Barbara Matera in 2 minutes is next.
Thank you, President. The awareness of the existing links between gender policy and climate change has recently been developed, and it hasn't really delivered proper gender mainstreaming in climate change policies. The international situation at the current time is not favourable. There's a risk that we won't achieve an international agreement on climate change. There is a major risk, I would even say. And a lot will be hinging on the Rio meeting later this year. Now, gender issues are, if you like, an opportunity when it comes to combating climate change, doing it better, more effectively and more fairly. Gender integration should be based on 2 principles. Firstly, try to pinpoint the effects of inequalities and combat the causes. The link between women and climate change would be helped by a system of collecting gender disaggregated gender and mean that we could intervene more effectively. It would help to save resources. Women, of course, consume more differently from men, and it would help us to meet the requirements of families. Being aware of the existing inequalities between men and women relates to 2 issues: support and the taking on of responsibilities. Both elements should be part and parcel of community policy making here. I hope that the link between gender and climate can be effectively made part of the EU programmes and not just in individual policy areas. Climate change affects all areas of human activity, and as such it should be included in a cross-cutting way in all projects and in all financial activities undertaken by the European Union. Thank you very much, President.
I thank you. Ms. Papadopoulou is next in 1 minute.
Hello? Hello? No. Κύριε Πρόεδρε, η αλλαγή του...
President, climate change is provoking economic and humanitarian crises and is having a major impact on poor and developing countries. Now, we're talking about women because they represent 85% of the victims of natural disasters because of which are caused by climate conditions, and they also make up the lion's share of climate refugees. There are a number of very interesting reports that I can agree to. For example, there's a proposal for more climate fairness or justice, environmental justice, and I think what we need to make sure is that we gender mainstream all our climate and sustainable development policies. Now, to do that, we need studies, technical studies to be carried out, and we also need to find a way to manage the risk of natural disasters so that we can stem climate migration. We need to have enough financial measures in place to fight climate change. So the European Union needs to integrate gender perspectives into all of these policies.
Thank you. Ms. Záborská is next in 2 minutes.
Chairman, Commissioner, I would like to thank the rapporteur for her work. But I'm lost when I'm reading the point 30 of the report. I quote, "The European Parliament recognizes that the growth of the population influences the climate and underlines the need to respond to the unsatisfied needs of women and men in the area of contraception in all societies." The end of quote. I have two questions. Does the rapporteur wants to say that we should stop having children to save the climate, to stop the changes? Should we, because of outhailing CO2, distributing condoms or tablets and providing services of reproductive health? If ideology leads someone beyond the borders of rationality, any rational discussion is pointless. This report suggests that women should be deprived of femininity. There shouldn't be mothers. None of the Millennium Development Goals mentions that there should be less children in the developing countries. That would be a contradiction. The life of a person, even though these people live many kilometers away from us, has the same value. Just because there is a lack of drinkable water, sometimes the UN Convention is convened, experts are summoned, and millions are paid for their so they live. But one of the main sources of poverty, according to this report, and also one of the main sources of the climate change, is the growth of population. But these statements are not so true, because the International Monetary Fund published in January 2011 assumption of 10 quickest growing economies of the world. 7 of the African countries are among them, and they have the highest natality. It's a pity that this only point mirrored all the positive points it contains. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Mazzoni is next in 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. With the KIIL-NIELSEN report, I think that the European Parliament is once again demonstrating how determined we are to support the creation of a fairer, more democratic society. Mr. Helmer called it an obsession, but that's wrong. It's the right way of doing things, a determination of creating a European Union which is fit for purpose to meet the challenges of this millennium. Mrs. Nielsen's report talks about integrating gender policies into climate change policies. Now, I have to say that despite the efforts of the rapporteur, I didn't entirely grasp this direct link. But I am, of course, happy to endorse the broad aims underpinning the report. The aims being basically to try to achieve a society where differences are no longer accepted. It's not possible to accept a society where women own less than 1% of global property, and they are 70% of people living on less than $1 a day. 17% only 17% of parliamentarians are women. Women earn a fraction of the wage and yet do 2/3 of the world's work. All of these issues need to be overcome, and I think Mrs. KIIL-NIELSEN's report is a clear condemnation of the state of play now, and it's an important tool. It's about trying to trigger the arsenal of instruments that Commissioner Potočnik referred to try to ensure that gender is mainstreamed across the board in all policy areas, because it's true that climate change hits the more vulnerable segments of the population hardest, women often being part of that. It's also true that we need to look at gender equality in a cross-cutting way in all policy areas, both at the EU level and at the national level. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Pietikainen is not in the chamber, so now it's time for the KHDI process. The first speaker is Romana Jordan.
Thank you very much. I've asked for the floor because I want to say myself that I agree that there is a specific in the relation between women and climate change. I do agree with Christa KLASS, though. We can't dwell on details, but we have to draw out the great issues, the important ones. I think that education is of key importance. There is a saying that you should educate a man and you will have one educated person, and if you educate a woman you will have an educated family. So education is really important. Awareness is also important because women affect paradigms within the family. Another thing, women are to a greater extent victims of climate change than men, and this should be given greater attention, especially when we're talking about development aid provided by the EU. In the end, I want to mention the representation of women in decision-making. I support all the endeavors that could lead to a greater participation of women in decision-making in general. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ms. YANNAKOUDAKIS.
Mike, please.
Thank you, President. To begin with, I would like to thank the rapporteur for an excellent report. But if you allow, I would like to take up a few critical issues on this way of thinking about the climate change. When we're talking about the climate, we very often only talk about numbers and markets. I think that when we're talking about climate change, we should centralize on people, those who have to meet climate change in their everyday life. Women in the developing countries who are in the worst position within climate change. Climate change has not only to do with the failure of markets. What it is about is how it affects their everyday lives. And this is often forgotten in the way of thinking. When we talk about climate change, we're talking about people, and on the second place we have numbers and markets. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Mr. Romeva.
Let's be clear about this. It's not a coincidence that most victims of natural disasters are women. This is to do with vulnerability. And they are vulnerable because of structural problems. Now, in this Parliament, we've listened to some very clear statements which should give us cause for concern. All Mrs. Nielsen has done is describe the situation in the world today, describing certain needs, describing certain challenges we face, things we need to do, and calling for the inclusion of women in all decision-taking process. That's her first point. And also, they're saying women should stop being victims and stop being players. That means they need more training, education and protection. Third point, we have to include gender considerations in all our climate change policies. That's what we need to do. Listening to some of our colleagues' reactions, what they were saying really only takes us back 200 or 300 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Miranda has the floor now.
Well, thank you, President. I'd like to congratulate Mrs. Nielsen for this excellent report. Women, as the rapporteur says, are the most affected by climate change. The climate is changing also as regards because we're not using instruments, policy instruments properly. It's because we are not meeting our responsibilities both in Europe and around the world. Let me give you a very specific example of everyday life in my country. Let me tell you about the case of women in the fishing industry. Women fishing for shellfish. climate change is affecting the industry because the environment on our coast is changing. There is less for them to catch the fish. The seas aren't clean, so their incomes are going down. For these reasons, I support this report. I support its environmental targets and the way it deals with the loss of women in the context of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thereby we close the debate, and now the commissioners, it is the commissioner's turn, Mr. Potočnik's turn, to reflect on the ideas heard in 2 minutes. Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you, President, honourable members. First of all, I would like to say that when it comes to women and climate, that we talk about a real and a serious problem, and that's why I appreciate very much the attention which was pointed to this direction from the rapporteur and all of you who contributed, and I'm pretty sure that also my colleague Connie Hedegaard appreciates that very much. There are a lot of convincing elements who have been also shared in this debate. The things which really stayed in my mind after this debate are some keywords like awareness, data, knowledge, education, mainstreaming, science. On community support for women and women's education, I could add that by 2015, all development financing proposals will include gender-specific indicators. And Horizon 2020, which is our new framework programme, climate-related projects will include gender-specific analysis. Some of you might know that I was in my previous mandate responsible for science and research. And the question of the women in science was one of the very serious questions which we tried to address also. Unfortunately, there is no quick fix. There are some developments which are very much encouraging nowadays. There are some facts that the number of female doctorate students is increasing more rapidly than it is for men, that the number of women researchers is growing at a rate nearly twice that of their male counterparts. So the situation is getting better, but that doesn't mean that we should not focus our attention also in the future. But the problem really is connected quite a lot when they move from studying into the world of work. Reality is that women scientists earn less than their male counterparts. More of them are employed by short-term contracts. They climb the ladder of success more slowly, and so on and so on. So these are all real issues, and I think that we should basically address them at the very core of the problems, and that holistic approach and also dealing through the social policy is something which should be used to the utmost extent. I have myself experienced the power of women in international negotiations, and I can say from my own experience that this is a fact. Finally, the thing which I would like to mention is in the context of something which we discussed yesterday. I was yesterday in Denmark, in Horsens. We have had the informal council, which was devoted to 2 themes. One was 7 Environmental Action Programme, which we will discuss later on, and this programme is actually related to the next episode of our environmental policy for the next mid-long-term view. And we have discussed also Rio+20, which is also something the same, but more in international, of course, environment. I can say that gender balance and also the role of women was quite underlined also in our discussions. It's important that we see those issues not only in the context of the climate change. It's important that we see them in the context of the green growth as such, or even broader to say, in the context of the sustainable development. As it was rightly pointed by some of you, inclusion and equity are absolute requirements for sustainable development. Just as development cannot be only about economic growth, nor can sustainability be only about protecting the environment. Development must be people-centered, promote rights, opportunities, choices, dignity, and green growth must also be inclusive growth, generating social progress and contributing to eradicating poverty and achieving greater equality, as well as sustaining our natural environment. By the way, the title of the conference in Rio, which we will be attending in June, it's exactly that. It's green economy in the context of poverty eradications. And all the issues, also the issues which are pointed in this report, are very relevant for those stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Before I give the floor to the rapporteur for final thoughts, I'd like to announce that the debate will be closed by a female Vice President of the Parliament. And now I give the floor to Ms. KIIL-NIELSEN.
Je savais, après avoir rencontré...
Having met Commissioner Hedegaard at the Women's Committee hearing, I knew that we could count on her support and the Commission's backing. I also knew that we would be able to count on the Danish presidency, because I'd heard some positive noises being made by them. I'd like to thank colleagues, men and women alike, who've spoken this morning, because I think that really reflects our collective efforts together. I think it's been something that's been very useful for all of us. It's a necessary debate, and we do need to continue in our awareness-raising efforts. But I think everybody has given his or her input to the report, and I'm delighted with that. I'm also sure that we'll get the backing of the Vilnius-based Gender Equality Institute, which was established in 2011. I'd like to do something I haven't done to date. I'd like to pay tribute to women in women's associations in the Parliament who've known for a long time that they need to stand up together when it comes to conserving resources and tackling climate change. Women have understood this for a long time in a number of countries. There's the Shipko movement in India, women who tied themselves to trees to save those trees. In Rwanda as well, where women managed to save 600 species of bean. There's Wangari Maathai as well. I'd like to pay tribute to her, who left us recently. She was part of the Green Belt movement, who saved millions of trees. For a long time now, women in the developing world have understood that they need to stand up and do something, so we know that they're with us too. Then there was the question of quota, which a number of people mentioned. For me, for my political group, we are indeed advocates of this tool. It's just a tool at the end of the day. We are the only political group that is equal, and we're proud of that, equal in terms of men and women. We need to make headway. If we don't use the quota tool, we will not manage to achieve better gender equality. So it's a tool, it's a means to an end, if you like. And then finally, I'd like to say what Einstein said. He said, a problem cannot be solved by the same level of conscience that created it. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Rapporteure. Κυρίες και κύριοι συνάδελφοι, η συζήτηση έληξε. Η ψηφοφορία...
Thank you very much. That closes the debate. The vote will be at 12 o'clock today. So we move on to the next report on our agenda. This is the report from Mr. Herbrandi, Our Life Insurance, Our Natural Capital, an EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2020. Firstly, I'm going to give the floor to the rapporteur, Mr. Herbrandi, for 4 minutes.
Dank u wel.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Colleagues, we're in the middle of an economic and financial crisis, and there's no getting around it. Newspapers are full of it every day. Television news leads with that story, and the European Council seems to be meeting about nothing else. But alongside that crisis, we have another crisis, a silent crisis. A silent crisis of disappearing species, disappearing habitats, and emptying oceans. And that's the crisis we're talking about this morning. And we all know the figures. 25% of all species in Europe are under threat. Only 1/6 of habitats in Europe are in full health, and 75% of all fish stocks are overfished. Now, the economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversities have issued a report which says that 3% of our GDP is lost every year because of a loss of biodiversity. So each year for Europe, that means we're losing 450 billion euros due to a loss of biodiversity. And that's more than the emergency fund for the euro, which Europe's leaders have been working so hard to gather together in the last 2 years. If you like, this is the largest multinational in Europe because nothing gives us so much employment and so much food and so much resources as biodiversity. Biodiversity, in a way, or nature, is the largest service provider in Europe. And any other multinational company of this size would be called too big to fail. It would be sacred. But if you see nature as a multinational company, well, we don't seem to save it. We just use nice words. And that's what we did 10 years ago, the last time that we issued this kind of a report. Things just stayed as nice words on paper last time around. Nothing was really done because other priorities held sway. And the most important question, therefore, today is, what are we going to do this time to make sure that when we get to 2020, we don't see that we've failed yet again to defend biodiversity? So let me start with our legal obligations. Is it too much to ask member states to keep to the law? We ask member states to keep to the law. We ask citizens, rather, to keep to the law, so member states should as well. So the Netherlands needs to look to how it defends the Westerschelde area. And other countries need to do the same with their other natural areas. We have a wonderful opportunity at the moment because we're reforming the agricultural policy, the fisheries policy, and the cohesion policy. Now, without farmers' help, we won't be able to protect nature, and without a strong nature,